Okay, this is Economic Nationalism Objective 3 about the significant changes to the American economy prior to the Civil War. And the primary changes take place initially with the colonial economy. Now, at first, 90% of Americans were still farmers leading up to the American Revolution, and tobacco was the leading crop at that time. However, if you remember, tobacco really destroyed the soil and wrecked a lot of things environmentally. So people, although they were making a lot of money off of tobacco, started to find out that they could do a little bit better with cotton as the main crop around 1800 to the Civil War, particularly with the advent of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Now, of course, if you remember, the bread colonies or the grain colonies were the ones around Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, but New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey were also considered the fertile bread colonies at that time as well. New England, meanwhile, was primarily known for its fishing and whaling. Now, this, of course, is prior to Samuel Slater's mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The triangle trade was also a major part of changes in the colonial economy at that time, as skippers would make a profit at each leg of the journey. For example, a skipper would sail some rum to the Gold Coast of Africa in exchange for slaves, that rum coming from New England. And then the skipper would take those slaves to the Caribbean for molasses. Now, as soon as he'd get the molasses, he would take the molasses back up to New England to make more rum, and the process would continue on. Again, the idea was that skippers were making a profit at each leg of the journey. So there were lots of different ways that the colonists were making money and surviving economically. Lumbering, and with the profits they made from the lumber to use ships and build houses and things like that, became very profitable. And shipbuilding became a major part of the colonial economy at that time as well. Through those two areas, lumbering and shipbuilding, the bottom line was the colonial economy, whether it was tobacco, bread, fishing, whaling, triangle trade, or lumbering and shipbuilding, seemed to be doing fairly well. Now, the Molasses Act of 1783 caused some changes to the colonial economy as well. The idea was, remember, that colonists in the trade with Britain would send raw materials to Britain, who would then make it into goods. Colonists, of course, want to buy the goods from Great Britain, but they can't afford to, and so the colonists started selling raw materials to other countries in order to get money. Well, the British decided to pass the Molasses Act, which made that very, very difficult to do, and as a result, colonists would smuggle and bribe their way around it just to continue to get money from other countries and not be so hung up on trading with Great Britain. Now, the Embargo of 1807 and the War of 1812 are also going to cause some major changes to the economy prior to the Civil War. In 1807, Thomas Jefferson cut off trade with Britain and France. That basically ruined the U.S. shipping industry. U.S. shippers started to switch to textile factories. It made no money or it wasn't worth it to be involved in shipping anymore. So once they switched to textile factories, buy American slogans and wear American slogans became very popular. The problem was that the American textile goods were substandard at best. James Madison, at his inaugural, actually wore some of the American goods to show support for what was going on, but he looked very sloppy. The American goods just weren't quite up to par. Well, 8 years later, the War of 1812 ended in 1815, so the embargo had been going on for 18 years, and trade with Europe reopened. Now, Britain had 8 years to build up a surplus of textile products, and once the war ended, it was now ready to sell to Americans at ridiculously low prices. When the surpluses were so high, they could sell at those low prices, and the British goods were of a better quality. Now, American textile manufacturers couldn't compete with the quality or prices of British goods now being sold again in the U.S., and so they demanded some protections so that Americans would have to buy their goods and not Great Britain's. Now, that led to the Tariff of 1816, which, if you don't know what a tariff is, it basically means making other nations raise their prices to sell things here, because, you know, if you are producing a series of goods, the standard retail markup for things is going to be 100%. If it costs you $8 to make a shirt, you're going to sell it for $16. But if you are charged to sell the product in a certain country on top of that, that's considered part of your production costs. Now, with the tariff, if it costs you $12 to produce a shirt, you got to sell it for $24. And that protects American businesses because they are going to offer their goods at lower prices, and therefore the demand for their goods will be a little bit better. So the Tariff of 1816 was really the first protective tariff ever passed in American history. By the 1800s, a distinctly American culture was developing, including industry, so the tariff is passed to protect American businesses. Now, with the tax, the British have to sell their, with the British being taxed to sell their products here, they have no choice but to raise their prices and make American goods a little bit more attractive. Another change to the American economy prior to the Civil War is the quote-unquote American system of 1824, which was developed by Henry Clay to create a greater reliance on domestic goods. Now, the American system called for three things in particular, and it's very important that you remember this because this comes up a lot on different tests, but it called for three things that were part of the American system. It called for a strong banking system, first of all. It also called for more tariffs to protect American businesses. Again, the idea is that if you tax other countries to sell their products here, it raises their production costs and they will have to charge more, and American businesses now can take advantage of that with lower prices. Okay? And the third thing was a network of roads and canals, which would, ironically enough, be funded by the tariff revenues to transport goods. So if you charge other people to sell their products here, then you use those extra revenues to build roads and canals here so we can transport our goods to each other even easier. So again, three parts to the American system: a strong banking system, more tariffs, and a network of roads and canals. There were also some very unfortunate changes to the economy prior to the Civil War in the series of panics that took place. Now, if you don't know what an economic panic is, it's when banks are going bankrupt and people are running to the bank to try to get their money out. You know, typically you give your money to a bank and they use it to loan out to businesses and people and personal investments and make money for themselves. But if they loan out too much money, then your investment, the money you've put in that bank, could dry up as well. If they loan out too much money and those loans don't get repaid, then you're stuck and so is the bank. Now, a series of these panics happened prior to the Civil War. Three big ones were the Panic of 1819, 1837, and 1857. Now, the Panic of 1819 was caused by land speculation in the West. There were too many people borrowing bank funds to invest in land, and then after they'd purchased the land, they couldn't sell it for profit or at least enough money to pay the banks back. So that was just money that the banks were just lost, money that they had of yours. Once you put your money in a bank, they loan that stuff out. That's them just losing it now. Now, the reckless banks who kept giving out the loans, and this is an important term you're going to want to remember, were known as Wildcat Banks. And many Wildcat Banks started foreclosing on property in order to get their money back somehow, because a bank without money is like a body without blood. When a bank runs out of money, it's out of business. So since the people who had taken out the loans to buy land out west couldn't pay them back, Wildcat Banks started foreclosing on mortgages that they had given back east. They started taking your home away from you and selling it at auction to recoup some of the lost funds. Millions of land investors and homeowners back east started to lose everything. And with spending coming down, the economy was coming down as well. Once you lose all that money, you can't spend it on things. And as you guys know, spending drives an economy. The Panic of 1837 was also another problem. It was very similar. Again, it was more land speculation as people wanted to buy territory out west and borrowed money to do that, and more Wildcat Banks at work or giving out loans in a very reckless fashion. The thing about the Panic of 1837 that made it a little different is that wheat crop failures started to happen that year, and because now there was a scarcity of wheat and it was a little harder to get a hold of, that meant grain prices became more expensive. mobs started raiding warehouses to get grain out because they didn't want to pay the high prices. And that again slowed down spending and slowed down the economy. But one of the worst ones was the Panic of 1857. Now, the Panic of 1857 was actually caused by not a grain shortage, but a grain surplus. There was so much grain that prices for it went down, and that meant you didn't have to produce as much, and without producing as much, then you didn't have as much money to spend because you weren't selling as much of it. Also, the dollar is backed by gold, and an increased gold supply just caused a rise in prices in the dollar as well. Once again, there was more Western land being sold, people gambling on buying the lands to sell it for a profit later on. That's called speculation once again. And once again, more Wildcat Banks at work, giving out reckless loans to these people so they could buy up this land. Remember, irresponsible banks do this. They'll give out way too many loans because they charge interest for every loan. So the idea is to give out the loan, eventually get that loan back with interest on top. So a lot of these banks were looking to make a major profit as well, and when they couldn't get the loans paid back, those banks go under, often taking your savings with it. Remember, a bank takes your money and loans it out to make money for themselves and to pay you back as well. In the Panic of 1857, 5,000 businesses had failed within a year. The North was the hardest hit, especially the grain growers. People started to say that the government should start giving acreage away, 160 acres at a time, instead of selling the land for profit. The thought was that it would encourage people to create more farms, and inadvertently it started the eventual Homestead Act of 1862, which we've already studied once already. Many people didn't like the idea. Eastern businessmen thought their labor force would just leave for the West, and didn't care for the idea that they'd have to hire more workers, possibly at higher prices because labor might be scarce. But the South survived it just fine. They were selling their cotton overseas at really good prices, but they did not like this idea about giving land away either, because the idea of free land out west meant that it would potentially add more states of people who would be opposed to slavery. The more people settled out west, the more potential states could start. And if they started and became free states, or those opposed to slavery, it could tip political power in Washington, D.C. Now, the Panic of 1857 eventually led to the Tariff of 1857, which was lower than the Tariff of 1816. The Tariff of 1816 had worked too well and had given the U.S. government an embarrassingly large surplus of money. Now, of course, this Tariff of 1857 was hated by northern businesses. This was less protection for them. You know, the British and other countries didn't have to pay quite as high a tax anymore, so it meant less protection for them in terms of prices. But the southern cotton producers thought it was great. Now, the main reason was because they never liked high tariffs. This is an important point to remember for later lessons, too. Southern cotton producers did not like high tariffs because it meant that other nations would buy less cotton from the U.S. in retaliation for not being able to sell their products in America. So the South was selling overseas. They never liked tariffs anyway, because when those countries tried to sell here, they got punished for doing so. And in retaliation, a lot of them would say to the South, we're not going to buy your cotton until you figure out a way to get your government to lower tariffs. Makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Anyway, those are some of the major economic changes that took place prior to the Civil War. In the next lessons, we're going to get involved with the railroad industry, steel, oil, and the major changes that took place there. Thanks for listening.